Okay, maybe we'll get started for those who are here. I'm sure others will show up. So tonight will be in English. If Ariel starts speaking too quickly, it's okay to just make a sign and he'll slow down. I have the same problem when I teach in English. I always say to students, if it's too fast, just let us know. It's no problem. Okay, so good evening and welcome to the third masterclass lecture of the 2023 spring semester. This lecture series is part of the semester 6 invited professor program, which was launched this year as part of the new curriculum. Our lecturer this evening has just arrived in France. He flew in 3 days ago, so there's still a little bit of jet lag. And we're very happy he's here. He has a very international profile and is currently based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania Weizmann School of Design. As a practicing architect, he has collaborated on a wide range of projects in Europe, Asia, Africa, and China. And he works at multiple scales, ranging from the building scale to the urban scale, and he's even been involved in landscape projects. In France, he has worked with Pierre-Louis Falocci, Didier Lefort Architecte Associé, and Atelier Serragi Architecte, and he even for a while had his own office based in Paris while he was here. He earned his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, his Master of Arts in Histories and Theories from the Architectural Association in London, and he holds his Bachelor of Architecture from the Technion in Israel. His teaching and research focuses on 3 principal themes, and we'll be seeing these themes cross through his lecture tonight. First, the relationships between construction technology, sustainability, and architectural expression across cultures. Second, the manifestations of climate and environmental specificities in building envelopes. And lastly, 20th and 21st century Japanese architecture and urbanism, in particular with a focus on the reinterpretation of local practices through the prism of resilience. He has conducted research as a Japan Society for the Promotion of Science Fellow at the Kenzo Kuma Lab in Tokyo, at Tokyo University. He was also the first visiting scholar of the Renzo Piano Foundation in Genoa. And in 2018, he curated the exhibition Critical Abstractions, Modern Architecture in Japan, 1868 to 2018. His teaching covers history and theory courses, studios, research seminars, and workshops, and he will, as of next year, be involved in the teaching in the doctoral program. He's going to be even more involved in the doctoral program coming up next year. He has spoken and lectured internationally in conferences. He has published widely in journals and edited volumes, and he currently is preparing a book about Japan, The Art of Yielding, Expressions of Architectural Resilience in Modern Japan. And after France, he is continuing on to Japan to continue work on the book. Tonight, he will speak to us about an age-old question. As technology enables the transformation of natural materials, such as timber and stone, to give them new properties, what forms should architects give those new materials? So please join me in warmly welcoming Ariel Genadt to the ENSA Normandy.
Thank you, Tricia, so much for having me. Thank you, Raphael and Valerie, and the rest of you for coming today, and to all the people online, Mom, Dad, and Caroline Maniac, who's there watching us, for introducing me to the school. And I hope this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship with a lot of you. My talk today is kind of the tip of the iceberg of things that I have been looking at in the past, I should say, 12 years at least. But it actually started earlier. So I'm gonna speak in English, but please, I know some of you, it's not your mother tongue, And if you have questions, I would be happy to take them after I speak, and I can do that in French. So don't hesitate to wait until the end. And also, if I speak too quickly, I'm happy to slow down at some points. So, as I said, the topic of the talk today actually begins when I was a student. I studied in an institute of technology, and at the time, after graduating, I thought I'd get a pretty good education, well-rounded. But gradually, as I was practicing, I saw that some of the things that I've been told, namely about how to treat materials and structure in their true nature, all of that became a little bit difficult sometimes when I was practicing as an architect. So I went and did a master's in history and theory to try to discover that other thing, a certain je ne sais quoi, that exists sometimes when we experience architecture, and that I didn't know how exactly to account for. I got some answers in the master's at the Architectural Association, but then I went back to practice, and again I became a bit frustrated with practice that is kind of maybe limiting our understanding of certain parts of our aesthetic experiences of architecture. And after about 6 years, I went back to academia and started a PhD to try to dig in. And then I really discovered that the first education that I got in my Bachelor's of Architecture was only half of the truth. And maybe the truth actually is not exactly what this is all about. And so that question of truth and architecture, or true expression of structure and materials in architecture, became something I gradually started understanding in my PhD studies. All of this is not to encourage you to do a PhD, but actually to tell you that it's absolutely okay at this point, if you don't understand everything about how to treat materials and what to show of the material properties. So I'll try to explain the title. I hope the title of the talk will become gradually, within the next 60 minutes, will become gradually comprehensible. It has 3 parts. It has the term material transformations, which is one aspect. It has the term strange, which is important, and it has the age of digital craft, which is another term which I will get to in the latter half, in the second half of the talk. My undergraduate studies, like most of the school, I probably should say, in the Anglo-French realm of the world, which probably encompasses, through colonialism, etc., or the diffusion of knowledge from Europe to other parts of the world, covers most of the architectural education in architectural schools as such. And the very central figure of that theory and philosophy is Viollet-le-Duc. I used to adore Viollet-le-Duc. I didn't know how central his thought was to modernism in general and to thought in the 20th century. And the main things that we can probably take with regards to form and structure is that form should be derived, there is a kind of moral obligation from the properties of materials, and it should guide, what we express of these materials. So stone should look like stone, and iron like iron, wood like wood, assuming form appropriate to their nature. As if, underlying this assumption, there is a nature of materials that we can all agree on because it's based on universal science. Now, most of the proposals are in Viollet's books, and some of his architecture are actually derived from this understanding. And of course, Viollet was extremely influential, not least because his text was widely read. It is one of the first texts that were translated also into English in the 19th century, and therefore a lot of people across the Atlantic could read it. Here, on this side of the Atlantic, to show you that Le Corbusier actually said that Violet's writing is one of the important texts that influenced his thinking. But importantly, we see in his the choice of words that truth is an important component of modernism. There is such a thing as a lie, and the styles are a lie, and therefore what we propose in the new spirit, the Esprit Nouveau, is true. And the other kind of book that was kind of very influential on Le Corbusier's thought was this one by Victor Cousin, which was widely read also at the time, which equated three things, the true, the beautiful, and the good. These are kind of foundational texts. On one hand, the rationalism of Viollet-le-Duc, and on the other side, the moral aspect of that truth. Albeit on opposite ends, and these were, Frank Lloyd Wright on the other side of the Atlantic was actually opposed to some of Le Corbusier's idea, but Wright too said that the most influential text on his work was the Dictionary of Viollet-le-Duc, which he had read in translation, of course, but you can see that some of the quotes that Frank Lloyd Wright produces regarding materials, such as this one, is almost derived one-to-one from Violet's thinking. He said, "I began to study the nature of materials, learning to see them. I now learned how to see brick as brick, to see wood as wood, to see concrete or glass or metal." And especially he was interested in looking at them under the microscope to discover the grammar of each material. He also widely used the term truth, with probably a very heavy moral aspect that probably derived from also his religious convictions as a Unitarian. Truth against the world. He said, there's many quotes. If you just Google Frank Lloyd Wright and truth, you'll see how many times he used the term truth. And of course, nobody really knows what he meant by that. Especially because gradually, as people started dissecting his buildings, we see that he couldn't actually stick to what he was preaching. So although he probably wanted to express brick as brick, there are things he wanted to do with his architecture, like large cantilevers, for example, that actually necessitated I-beams that are steel, but these would be completely hidden. So there are many other fallacies with regard to structure and the fact that some of it must be not expressed and actually hidden in order for other materials to be expressed. There's actually a text by Ove Arup, the engineer, who tells you about the fallacy of modern architecture with regards to structure. But Frank Lloyd Wright might, maybe we associate him with the first part of the 20th century. In the second part, Louis Kahn suggests a very similar type of thinking. In a very famous lecture that he gives, I believe it was in the University of Pennsylvania, where he was teaching, the same building where I am teaching in these right now, in Philadelphia. Kahn has this memorable dialogue with a brick. He says, if you speak to a brick and you ask the brick, well, brick, what do you want? The brick says, well, I like arch. A brick wants to be set in the form of an arch. And he says, but look, I want one too, but arches are expensive and I can use a concrete lintel. What do you think of that, brick? And the brick says, I like arch. For Kahn, there is such a thing as even the will of each material to be something structurally. So, and that probably derives directly from the nature of the material, its properties that imply that you should use it in a certain way. And in cases where there's a conflict, you can probably put the two together. So you have the concrete lintel that's straight and the curved arch on top of it. This is 1972, just to tell you that this idea that started in the 19th century with Viollet-le-Duc about the nature of material, truth of expression, didn't go away throughout the 20th century. But there were always problems with this proposition. Because if you ask stone what it wants, well, we have very different expressions of stones throughout the history of the world architecture. It's hard to say if the pyramid is the true expression of stone or if it's a Gothic cathedral. And these are obviously very, very different. And these are, of course, you know that Viollet-le-Duc preferred the Gothic expression of stone, but that in itself is questionable. Doesn't stone like compression better? Doesn't it like heft? It likes to be heavy rather than light. So there were inconsistencies in the proposal about the nature of material and a true expression of each material. And this was not a new thing in the 19th century. It was actually known already under Vitruvius. So Vitruvius already 2,000 years ago, in the first century before Christ, already knows, or proposes at least, a speculation that the Greek temples were actually originally built in wood. And that this proposal, or this theory, can explain the ornament that we find engraved on the facades of the temples. So in that sense, the gutai, which were originally probably nails, become sculpted in marble, and the triglyphs, which were the finials, so the end of the beam, they were marking the end of the beam, become sculpted here in marble. And this was, of course, propagated, so everybody knew about it, and Auguste Choisy, in his book, includes it and illustrates it. Vitruvius himself actually, the drawings of Vitruvius actually did not survive, so he was illustrated throughout from the Renaissance onwards. The other architects and theoreticians in the 19th century also were looking at funerary monuments that survived. And those that survived in many different cultures, in Assyria, in other places in Mesopotamia, but even all the way to China, those were usually built of durable materials, namely stone, marble. But there was something strange about their tectonics. Tectonics being the expression of structure, and not so much the way the forces are transmitted, but how the architect or the builder wanted you to perceive that. So in a monument like this that is made of stone, there are protrusions here of the elements that actually are not justified by the necessity of structure. Because it's a compressive structure, you only need the continuation, the vertical continuation. Everything that protrudes is redundant. And yet, the builders decided to extrude it. So that gave rise to speculations that even these monuments were actually originally made of timber. So there is a mismatch between the materials that the buildings are made of and the way the form is actually conveying a different set of structural logic. The person in the 19th century that proposes an alternative explanation of history altogether from Viollet-le-Duc is Gottfried Semper. And in this sense, we can speak of an alternative tradition because Semper would be from the Germanic Austrian kind of way of thinking. And we have the rationalist strand, which is more French, Anglo-French, which ruled basically and still is in many parts of the world. But if we look at Semper as an important 19th century figure, he publishes at least one book of over 1,000 pages, which is called simply Style, but in the technical and tectonic arts. And in this book, he proposes that it's a massive book that is really worth at least holding in your hand once and actually reading some parts of it. So I'll just kind of whet your appetite. He proposes a theory that he calls the theory of material change, or Stoffwechsels in German. This is, if you look up in the dictionary, this is translated as metabolism, and it's not really a coincidence because he actually borrowed it from biology, which is a new field in the 19th century. The idea was that throughout history, in many cases, there were original forms that were petrified, so remained frozen, while the material gradually moved to a more durable material. The reason for that, according to Semper and other theoreticians, is that by moving into a more durable material, these elements of design could be commemorative, so serve a wider community throughout the ages, because they would survive for many generations. So we're moving from a type of ephemeral, temporary architecture with certain materials, like a woven basket, for example. And then this woven basket, as you can see here, is actually made of stone. Why is that important? Because it is in this mismatch between the material and form that we find cultural meaning. If we try to understand a certain society, what was important for that society, we would know that by seeing which forms have been actually shifted into different materials from what they originally were. So that is the kind of, in a nutshell, what the Stoffwechsel theory is about. Now, I painted this in blue as the alternative to the rationalist explanation of history. Because for Violet and for most people who studied in the Beaux-Arts and afterwards, form was to be mostly linked, primarily linked, to the properties of material and the structural logic. But for Semper, he says these are very important, and he actually dedicates 2 volumes out of 3 to this idea of the relationship between the properties of materials and form. But he says, and very importantly, that form cannot be solely explained by the properties of materials, because we find so many mismatches throughout history. So he's trying to take that Vitruvian supposition that indeed the Greek temples were originally made of wood and see other examples, but actually make that as the rule rather than the exception. He spends, I believe, 200 pages on explaining knots, strings, threads, and he says these you can find in many parts of the world, of course, but the original idea of a knot or of a thread, a knot links. Any strip can link together. That is, on one hand, a functional proposal, but on the other hand, it has meaning, because bringing many into one and making the one stronger than the many separated is very much a social idea. And therefore, at some points, people invent the reef. So that's an idea that things come together, and that signifies glory, victory, or anything important, for example. And here, different meanings to different ways of weaving. This fascination with textiles will become very central to his text, and according to Semper, textiles, not masonry, are at the origin of architecture. Primarily because textiles are more expressive, because you have patterns that were formed in textiles. And sometimes, and according to Semper, expression of a cultural meaning or values was at the basis of the will to create architecture. Then you had to actually hold up this textile or expressive element that you made, and therefore you created structure and frame. So tectonics came after that. And then masonry was actually not that important. It was, for Semper, relegated to infrastructure. The important thing that we have to take out of this is that material properties alone cannot explain forms. Only a historical technical analysis can explain them. Historical technical meaning you have to look at the culture, what was important for each culture. Many years after Semper, when Semper was discovered in France, which is, believe it or not, only 30 years ago, Semper was only translated into English around 1985, which not all of Semper actually, The book Style only was translated in 2005, which is incredible. So we have been kind of missing out on all of this alternative theory, and for many years all of us thought that Viollet-le-Duc is all we need to know. But Semper actually makes a lot of propositions that with some tweaking can be very useful for us today. And the one who kind of spotted it and tried to make more of it is Bernard Cache in around the year 2000, where he proposes that, well, I should probably go one back. Semper had these 4 categories of primary materials related to procedures. So the procedures and the materials originally were linked, but gradually there were shifts between the procedures and the materials. Semper listed them as a list, and Bernard Cache proposes to put them in a matrix. And when you put them in a matrix, it's no longer one-to-one. You could actually have wood that is used as textile and clay that is used as stereotomy. So that already multiplies the possibilities of material expression and goes very well with Semper's idea that there were shifts, mismatches between materials and the form that was issued from the material. Why? Because there was a cultural necessity to change that. And therefore people invented or used processes that they borrowed from another. They knew how to build a wall, but they didn't know really how to do it with certain ceramics. So they said, oh, what about putting these together? So look how many possibilities you have just by taking these 4 materials with these 4 procedures. And he goes further to actually say, well, today we obviously don't have just these 4 traditional materials that Semper looks at. We have all of these, and metal, concrete, and glass are the most common ones. Therefore, let's see, what if Semper was here today? What are the procedures and materials that we can add to this list? And what are the things we can do and all the different combinations that we can have with them? Now, he goes further to include biology, to include other elements that we might discuss whether these are actually building materials, but that's for another lecture maybe. Today I'm just going to focus on concrete and glass, and from the first list I will focus on stone and wood, because these materials are not only still with us, but they are more relevant than ever. So before we move on, and before moving on to actually showing you examples of these different mismatches between material and form, the question that we need to also pose is, what are they good for? Why do we actually need to pay attention to these material transformations? Why is it important that there is a mismatch? We might actually say, well, since today truth is not so important anymore, then why do we care? And the question is, let's look at this in a positive light. Let's look at this, what can we actually gain as architects and as a society from these material transformations? The first, I won't explain them now, but I'll explain them in the next 10 minutes, so I promise. The first aspect is prolonging the aesthetic experience towards a poetic expression. In a nutshell, if we use a material exactly as everybody expects it to be used, you basically see it, you get it, you move on. According to some people, this is not the purpose of architecture. This may be construction, but architecture is there maybe to provoke something, a different view or a discovery of reality of the world. And therefore that is a revelation, a different, or seeing the world in different light, which is the poetic aspect of it. The second part is placemaking, or something that goes against romantic historicism. Placemaking is an issue today, as it was, of course, when place was discussed more widely in the 1970s and 80s, because if you go to any big city in the world, you actually ask yourself sometimes, where am I? we are kind of losing the locality of some of the architecture. So these material transformations can actually work towards that placemaking. The third one is creating meaning in an age of engineered materials and digital craft. So I gave you kind of a hint with Bernard Koch's proposal that we can add materials to the list, right? Except Bernard Koch doesn't actually speak of meaning. He says, we just have all of these possibilities, let's explore the possibilities. But what is ultimately the goal is that it isn't just about material experimentation, it's about making architecture a relevant cultural agent. And that we can do if we consciously look at how materials and form relate. Because some forms and the way to treat them are actually ingrained in the local know-how of some places. Therefore, they could have meaning for certain people, but not for other people. They could have meaning in one place, but maybe not in another. So that is a way of kind of countering the universality of using materials the same way everywhere. The first aspect, which is about the prolongation of the aesthetic experience and the poetic and teasing out poetics out of material and form, comes from, or could be more easily understood through the term defamiliarization. This is the common translation of the Russian word ostranenie, which was sometimes translated as strange making. Literally, it's strange making. And this is by Viktor Shklovsky, who is a literature critic who writes the following. He says, the goal of art is to create a sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing a thing. The device of art is defamiliarization of things and the complication of form, which increases the duration and complexity of perception. From this, you probably have, if you read literature, you probably have experienced this in cinema or in literature, where you read a description of a place, for example, and that place sounds awfully familiar, but the author does not call it by its name. He describes, James Joyce describes a city, and you know, I think I've been there. It's probably Dublin, but actually he doesn't call it Dublin. Why would he do that? Actually to attract your attention to the original, not so that you concentrate on the new defamiliarized thing, but actually it reminds you what the qualities of the original were. But it's doing it not in a direct way by showing it to you and telling you, but by making you think about it and actually try to imagine, oh, wait a minute, he changed certain things. It prolongs your aesthetic experience, and then you discover certain things that you wouldn't have if it was just said to you. So defamiliarization is a technique in art and poetry of presenting common things in an unfamiliar or strange way, so that the art sheds new light on the familiar world. This is an example in art. You might have seen this. It's in the Museum of Modern Art by Merritt Oppenheim. When you look at it, you say, this is probably, there's something underneath there, something that I probably held every day and had coffee in. And yet, now I can no longer have coffee in it. So it prolongs your engagement with the object. It doesn't need necessarily to have meaning in the sense, oh, this means a furry cup. That is not the point, but it makes you enjoy it longer than you would a simple cup of tea. In the 1980s, the couple of theoreticians who kind of brought back defamiliarization, especially relating directly to Shklovsky's texts, are Liane Lefebvre and Alexander Tsonis, when they were discussing first classical architecture and a bit later critical regionalism. So these are the theoreticians who coined the term or brought critical regionalism as a term into architecture before Kenneth Frampton borrowed it from them and became famous for borrowing it. He always credited them for it. But here they relate directly to Shklovsky's text by saying, according to this theory, the essential feature of literary text is the transformation of ordinary language into poetic language, what Shklovsky called roughened form. It brings about certain characteristics of a text that make its linguistic organization deviate from ordinary use. Thus, the poetic identity of a building, and here they try to apply defamiliarization not to literature but to architecture. So for architecture, it depends not on its stability, its function, or its efficiency of means of production, but on the way which all of the above have been limited, bent, subordinated by pure formal requirements, which is what Gottfried Semper said in the 19th century. He said, unlike Viollet-le-Duc, who thinks that efficiency, function, the property of materials defines form, these are important, but they have always been inflected by other formal operations. So that's how the two are related. Now, what can we do with it? And that relates to the second question of creating place or identity to certain places as opposed to universal. Now, we have to remember that when they speak of critical regionalism, this is a reaction to a common trend in architecture that is called regionalism. So they are actually proposing something that goes against romantic regionalism. What was romantic regionalism? Basically saying modernism erased the identity. It proposes a universal model for all places around the world. We are proposing, according to regionalism, to actually mimic the forms that were built here before. We have that everywhere, and it's still with us in many regions. They're just building the old form again. They're just mimicking the forms. Although technology has moved on, society has moved on, our values have moved on, but these forms are, for some people, giving them comfort that they are recognizing their own culture. In critical regionalism, the idea is not to mimic these old forms, but to make them strange. And therefore, they say romantic regionalism employed familiarization. Critical regionalism selects these regional elements, for their potential to act as support, physical or conceptual, of human contact and community, what we may call place-defining elements, and incorporate them strangely rather than familiarly. It makes them appear distant, hard to grasp, difficult, even disturbing. It disrupts the sentimental embrace between buildings and their consumers, de-automatizing perception and pricking the conscious, to use another of Shklovsky's expression. So pricking the conscious, because we cannot approach these buildings directly with our rationale by saying, oh, I see brick, a brick wants arch. But what if I see brick and the brick is laid in a way that I've never seen it before? Then meaning can arise. Why has this been done in the time and place where it was done? And these differences are what creates meaning in a certain place. That's the proposal of Tsonis and Lefebvre. The second why, okay, beyond just the aesthetic experience, like the Merritt-Oppenheim cup that doesn't necessarily have a specific meaning. Here it is because in a certain place there was maybe another tradition from another material that was used to transform the brick. There won't be more text on the screen, now only sentences. But this was kind of the heavy lifting of the theory. I hope you enjoyed that. Now we can move on, just sit back, enjoy the ride. There's lots of great examples. In Japan in the 1930s, there was kind of a nationalist surge, and the Japanese government decided that there is a national style. This is an example of what Tsonis and Lefebvre and many others have critiqued as romantic regionalism. Despite the fact that reinforced concrete was already used in Japan, the government decided that all governmental buildings should have a roof that was called the imperial roof. and that became known as the imperial roof style, that buildings should be recognized as Japanese because they have this type of roof. Now, after the war, when many of these official public buildings, 70 cities in Japan were completely wiped off the ground, 30? Many of these cities were completely wiped off the ground. They really had an opportunity, in a sense, to reconstruct and reconsider how to create identity and place in many of these cities. And the architect that kind of rises from the ashes, if we can say, Kenzo Tange, who becomes the greatest 20th century Japanese architect by general consensus, I think, really looks at what we might retrospectively call defamiliarization and going against this romantic familiar forms. You look at this building and you might think of a pagoda, but if you look closely, it really isn't a pagoda. The roof is really not the same. The way these beams are disposed are not really the same, and especially there's no finial and there's no shape in the end. So some things are familiar, but you actually can't put your finger on what exactly is the original. That is a form of defamiliarization. It becomes very strange if you actually look at the structural purpose of the structural functioning of the building. From a distance, it might look to you like it's made of wood, and that's really what he wanted you to look at, because the tectonics, the proportions of the beams and the way they are assembled, the way they protrude beyond the slabs, actually hints towards a logic of wood framing. But of course, if you go a bit closer, you know it's made of concrete. And if it's made of concrete, this logic doesn't hold. You really don't need these beams, especially not in these proportions. It's a very unusual proportion for beam. Therefore, what is the function? Well, this is a type of material transformation. We're taking the old tectonics that everybody knows because this is our national identity, because we have amazing craftsmen that can build this, but now we only let them build the formwork for the concrete. They can do amazing formwork because they're great carpenters, and all the surface of the concrete is lined with these slats of wood that will give a texture of wood to the concrete. So in Japan, unlike in other countries where concrete was really a replacement of stone, concrete was a replacement of wood. And this is the surface, a close-up on the surface of the Hiroshima Museum, also by Tange, very similar to most of his concrete buildings. Here you see another example of a town hall that needed to give kind of the expression that it's related to a tradition of construction. In this case, it's a storehouse originally, but a famous one, an important one in Japan. And therefore, the details of the corner are kind of, again, imitated in concrete. There is no structural logic for these to protrude beyond their functional length. There is no reason to actually offset them. In concrete, this doesn't make sense. This is all a rhetorical gesture, which is not to be undermined. This was necessary for a nation to rebuild its identity. This created a place. A different type of material transformation here, concrete, this is kind of directly related around the same time that Tsonis and Lefebvre speak of critical regionalism. Here, it's more for the experiment. When you look at the Lloyds of London, next time that you cross the channel, you will go to this building, you'll see, oh, it's made of concrete. But actually, look at the details of Kenzo Tange, how he uses concrete, and look at this. Neither one of them actually uses concrete in its nature, probably because concrete, we don't really know what the nature of concrete is. So here, the engineer, Peter Rice, and Richard Rogers, the architect, decided to actually give concrete the expression of steel, because there is a tradition of steel construction around there, so that would probably make more sense. And now if you think about it, this is actually there's so much steel reinforcing the concrete that you can actually say, well, we're just dressing up the steel, so let's express what's actually behind it. So these are some of those details. Peter Rice speaks very directly on about this sort of material transformation. He tried to do that with other materials as well. I'm moving on to stone. This is a long story, obviously, and stone has been already in the 19th century, people started understanding that this could be used actually as cladding rather than load-bearing, because steel structures were already starting to come to the fore and being used widely. This before concrete even. In this case, Adolf Loos had definitely an issue, a moral issue with truth. I mean, a lot of his writings are very much about how a man should be well dressed and how a woman, what kind of underwear a woman should wear, because you have to be true and honest inside out on all layers, etc. And in this case, cladding the main structure, if you can't actually show that structure, cladding it is fine as long as you tell people that it's cladding. Now, how would you do that? Well, you can use, you can treat the stone, in this case it's Cipollino marble. If you slice it and you open it like a book match, this would mean, this is a hint that it's very thin. If it's very thin and it's used for its texture, that means it's cladding. That is okay, because I am telling you that I'm fooling you, basically. And in this case, even more, slightly more rationalist, or pushing forward the idea that I'm telling you that this is cladding, with Otto Wagner, that actually leaves the pins that hold up the stone slabs as dressing on the facade. Behind it, you can use cheap brick, and that's fine. You don't have to show it. Everybody knows this is modern material, modern construction. You can use the cheap materials, hide them, and put more expensive ones, but very thin layers of them, as long as you tell your viewer that you're fooling them. Here, in a house in Japan, Kengo Kuma went very far in actually using stone as textile. If I didn't tell you this is stone, you'd probably imagine, oh, these are very light, it must be a very light material. This is actually travertine stone. And these are especially misleading when you look at it, because you see there's no overlap between the pieces. So you know this cannot possibly be load-bearing. In fact, it's really a curtain made of tiles that are just connected at the edges, and actually waves, even when the wind blows, you can actually hear it move. It makes direct reference to patterns that are well known throughout Japan as textile patterns, the ichimatsu, or the checkered pattern. And these are some of the details how this is all connected. So basically woven like a textile. Not far from there, in Tokyo, when you first look at this building, you say, oh, glass block. I know glass blocks. Glass blocks, they're blocks. So blocks are typically laid one on top of another, sometimes with mortar. This is the load-bearing construction, typically. Except here, this is really a curtain wall made of ceramic elements, because glass is actually a ceramic process, if you think of the Semper part. So this is a ceramic process and then assembled as a textile, and absolutely not like masonry as you would expect. Renzo Piano actually called it the glass kimono. And you can get a hint if you're in the eye of an architect, because you can actually see that the curtain doesn't touch the ground, and he leaves it and he actually trims it like the trim of a Hermes scarf that is hand sewn by one person in France, very rare. So he actually shows you that this is like a textile. It becomes even more kind of scary because it hangs over your head when you enter the boutique, and in the corner he actually reveals the whole idea of weaving these blocks. And now they're massive blocks, they're not the small ones, these are custom made 45 by 45 centimeters. And that's the detail in the corner. This is in Ginza in Tokyo. And that's a drawing one of my students made to actually express that idea of the curtain that is completely suspended. It also reflects the local environment, which is actually also associated with these kimono that has patterns of the landscape on them. Moving on to wood, and so this is the last material, but there are many different transformations, and this is perhaps maybe the most controversial, even more than those previous ones that I showed, because my suggestion here is that we haven't, I say, the community of architects, we haven't been careful enough in the vocabulary when we speak about wood today. Because very often we speak about wood as if wood is one material. In fact, most of us, and probably most of you who will graduate hopefully soon, will not even be using logs at all. You will be using engineered wood. Engineered wood most often has properties that are closer to steel than it is to wood. So when you say wood, I would ask you, what do you mean? What exactly is the material that you are referring to? These are some of the qualities that logged wood had. Okay, first of all, trunks are not symmetrical. Although they are round, they always have one side that goes to the south and one to the north. So if you take a tree from the southern hemisphere, where a lot of these forests are grow, the side that faces north is actually stronger and it has more knots because it faces more sun. In the southern hemisphere, the sun comes from the north. It has sunny sides and shady sides. It has varying hardness due to the fact that some of it has more photosynthesis than the other. It has structural directionality. So not all sides of the log, as you can see here, are as strong, so you can't use them actually. You can't flip a beam in any direction. It has grain, which is not only structural but also aesthetic. If you look at the beam, it also has other issues. So the end grain also is more sensitive to absorb humidity because it's more porous. And the age of logs is apparent. In old buildings, in traditional temples, for example, in Asia, when you had large beams, not everybody could afford them. If you could afford a very long tree, a very large beam, it's probably a high status building. So the age of the wood and the size of the wood was actually telling you the status of the building. None of these exist in the materials that we actually use today. These are just 6 of the most common ones that we use. You can, if you haven't, I mean, I'm sure you know some of them. If you now think of these properties that I spoke about logs, none of these exist here. I'm not saying it's the end of the world. I'm just saying let's be aware of it. We probably also gained some other properties that might be great, except this is a material transformation. When we have moved from logs into engineered wood, we are no longer speaking of the same material. It basically doesn't have any of the original properties that we can quantify, except for the fact that it uses an organic material. And even that, we have to make sure that it's 100% organic because there's a lot of glue that goes into these engineered materials. And the glue itself not always comes from organic sources. It could and it should, but so here are some examples of material transformations that happened with these new types of engineered wood. This is a town hall by Kangakuma in a small village in the mountains in the Kyushu island in Japan. I've noted here some elements from that chart by Bernard Kasch. So if you remember that, I kind of took the wood and tried to conjugate them in the different categories in the chart. So we can find stereotomy, so wood used as stereotomy, which originally, remember, was associated with stone. We can tectonics because there is wood framing. There is also textile weaving. So just by looking at the facade, you can tell some parts are not load-bearing, and they are probably only veneer. That would be a procedure, craft procedure associated with textiles and not with wood. Here, it looks familiar, but actually it's defamiliarized. I will go into that, but at first sight, it looks like these pieces of wood are actually stacked. They are not interlocking. This is a drawing also by one of my students that kind of reveals the secret of this building. This refers to the first part where I spoke about the truth of the building. You have to know where you can spend your expressive means. And in this case, it was important for the town hall to put the idea that they can process wood in a very sophisticated way, and especially engineered wood, because the town has a long history of wood production, but they wanted to show off or to showcase the capacity of the local contemporary practice. So this is the wood used, the sugi. It has a large element here in the center, which is the one exposed where the public gets in. So this is the showcasing of what they can do. The facade, of course, is also showcasing that. Behind it, everything that is here in black poché is actually a concrete structure. But you wouldn't know that unless you saw my lecture, because the architect typically hides it. But I got permission from him. He actually told me, well, in your lecture you should say that. So I'm returning just to the textile and weaving. This is a close-up picture that I took of those panels and the way they are suspended to tell you that you should always, you should be wary of what you find online, because some of these pictures you don't know who took them and what is the motivation behind it. But the architect, actually in this case, almost all of Kuma's buildings, there is a very intentional showing of what is, a bit like Adolf Loos, what is cladding and what is structural. And this is one way of doing it. Here, I'm returning to that point where I was mentioning that these elements are actually stacked. So there is very little notching. Notching being you cut one to imbricate it into the other. Originally, this is probably the reference, right? Because these bracket sets are the traditional temples, the way they were built. This is in the Buddhist tradition, not the Shinto tradition. Nevertheless, these were stacked and notched, but there is no glue or nails that connects these pieces. That was important because they actually had to move for actually to allow flexibility for earthquakes. Here, when you first look at it, you say, well, this is going to collapse if I just push it. This actually looks like a house of cards. And that's actually what the architect wanted you to feel. He wanted you to think of the building as something that is not very massive and heavy like those Kenzo Tange buildings, remember in the 1950s, where the nation was supposed to rebuild itself as strong, resilient, and made of concrete. Here, it's a different era. Here, Japan and certain of these municipalities hire Kengakuma especially to give an image of fragility, of being actually flexible to change with the local environment, to change with any climatic change. So these buildings are monumental, okay, but it's a weak monumentality. And that is exactly what these tectonics and the idea that this doesn't look stable actually is trying to express. But how does it do it? Because structurally, this wouldn't pass code. Well, spoiler, there are nails. Okay, and this is a picture that you will not see online. The engineer actually gave me the picture. So the other element that you can see here is that this actually, anything that goes beyond it, remember what Kenzo Tange was doing with the pieces of concrete that were going beyond. They were not structural. Neither are these, actually. You need spacers, but you actually don't need that extra wood. This is to make you feel like the pieces are going to fall. And this is what it looks like inside. It's a kind of tour de force of carpentry and of tectonics. There are also some metal elements which are associated in the local unconscious with the high-end nobility houses could afford nails. Now, metal nails are typically not used in Japanese carpentry except if you could afford them. Jumping a bit forward, of course, something is gained because this being glue laminated wood, it gives you increased directionality, so it actually stresses the directionality of the beams. These beams, if they had been made with logs, with massive logs, would be 5 times higher because of the span. So this actually gives them proportions of steel beams that look extremely thin and actually striated to make them look as if they're actually weaker than what they are. This building in the same town, at first sight you say, oh, I've seen this, probably some temple or something. But actually nobody could put their finger on what it is because it doesn't really have one precedent. And people who kind of blame Kengakuma for being an expert in reviving Japanese architecture, actually that's not exactly what he wants. It's actually not what he wants. He's actually trying to defamiliarize some of these elements, not to repeat them. None of these buildings by Kengakuma repeat traditional elements. In fact, if you look at them, they do some things that some of the local carpenters are like, oh my God, this is so different from anything traditional. In this case, perhaps these were some of the precedents, the cantilevered structure, but I mean, you look at it, maybe there's some principles in common, but actually it really acts very differently. These, of course, are entirely made of wood, whereas this actually has these steel connectors, and there is minimal notching, but you can do that because you have these hidden bolts that go through the timber. And of course, there's a big secret in the middle, is that everything looks like it's supported by one wood column. It's really steel inside, but it's completely clad. So much for truth. The end crane, actually, these are the white pieces here that are makes reference to this tradition of sealing the end grain with lime so that termites and humidity cannot go in, because this is, as I mentioned before, the most porous and fragile part of the element. But immediately when you do it, it's associated with the traditional structures, despite the fact that this is not at all the same material. The other aspect of, in another building is that a lot of people who came to Japan in the 19th century, a lot of modern architects thought, oh, everything is exposed, all the structure is exposed. We understand Japanese buildings because look at these carpenters, they really exposed all the structure, we can understand it. Actually, most people don't understand how Japanese joinery works because it was a tradition to actually hide the way every joint works. This was part of the skill. The ruse is actually to hide the way you can connect the elements, because it gave not only prestige, but also it protected your trade secret. So between carpenters, there was actually rivalry. Who can hide better the way these two things are connected? If you look at this, just by looking at it, you have no idea how to take it apart. So hint, hint, this goes in 45 degrees. Kuma uses this in this case. The material is the same. This is actually solid wood. So these are actually cut from solid pieces of wood. But the procedure is actually more like weaving, because he interlocks these pieces in a way that one goes above and one goes underneath, and you have to twist them as you would with threads. And believe me, I went to this building actually, and the client asked me, oh, look, you're an architect, you should probably be able to put this together. It's not so obvious if you haven't done it before. And this is what the whole thing looks like when it's assembled. This does have structural capability to support the roof, but in Japan, you're not actually allowed to support the roof only with wood structures for code reasons, so there is a concrete wall behind it. But you can have a hint of it here. But of course, that's not the rhetorical part. This is not what should be shown on the outside. But when you look at it, it really doesn't look like a heavy traditional temple. It looks like perhaps a textile. And this is what it looks like from the inside. You actually have to lie on the ground and look up if you want to be immersed in this mesh. Here, another example of using wood, surprisingly, as a textile and weaving it really as like a patchwork. The shape of the roof suggests that this is like a piece of cloth or a string where you can hold it and load it with equal loads, and it will just take a catenary curve. So it's a curve that's created naturally by these forces. But of course, how can you actually do that with pieces of wood? This is what the roof looks like on the inside, and these are actually assembled, woven with steel threads. This is what it looks like under construction, and there are steel threads that go through these pieces. So there is stereotomy in these pieces in as much as they are cut as if they were pieces maybe of stone, and then they're woven, a little bit like what Kuma did with the stone and weaving it. We have one example in France, which is not far from here. It's kind of everything you can do with wood except using it as wood, basically. Well, it's not really wood because it really is glulam. It is woven like a textile. It's also using procedures that are similar to ceramics, because in order to curve the wood in two directions, not in one direction. Glulam beams, we know how to curve them in one direction because they are layers and the layers overlap and they can shift if you press them. But if you want to curve it in the other direction, that's a different story. And part of it needs to be thermoform, so under heating in certain conditions or steaming it. So that would be associated, according to Bernard Kasch, to ceramics. And finally, stereotomy, you can't see it here, but you can see it in the next picture. Culturally, I have to say, I never really understood what a Chinese hat, in this case, has to do with Metz. But maybe that speaks of cultural diversity, I don't know. The transposition here actually is from woven straw. So straw can bend in all these directions, but once you do it with wood, it's much more complicated. These are the parts that I mentioned as stereotomy, because these are actually stacked. So you actually cut pieces in order, it's like the spacers in the Kuma building. And that's what the whole thing looks like when it's woven. I don't know, perhaps when you're out of kind of specific cultural context, the best thing you can do is relate to nature. So maybe this actually relates to nature in a more general way. And this is the last example, I think, that also employs, so there are two systems here actually. This is a wooden frame that probably relates very simply to tectonics. And the other one, which is again curved, so these are glue laminated and curved. And in this case, it is specifically important because of the function of the museum. Hiroshi Naito is one of those Japanese architects who are very humble and modest and almost unknown outside of Japan, deserves a lot more attention in my humble opinion. This is the interior of the museum, and it is a maritime museum. The Maritime Museum, of course, makes some reference to the old techniques of building the ships that are exposed inside the museum. Because they used to employ these pieces of wood that are actually bent, very often in two directions, actually. And those of you who will take my atelier starting next week, we will actually go to the Maritime Museum here and see how this is done. So in this case, the important aspect to speak about is the reason that on one hand you expose the structure, and on the other hand, what is the method employed, and how do you choose the method employed? What kind of tectonics or what kind of procedures are used to use the wood? They're not all the same. This is what the architect Hiroshi Naito has to say about it, surprisingly, because he is, when you look at most of his buildings, he would say, he's probably a fan of Viollet-le-Duc. And actually, surprisingly, you read that exposing structure is something that should not be done unless there is a necessity and purpose for doing so. In this case, the necessity and purpose of exposing structure is to make a connection specific to the place and the content of the museum. The second thing that he says is, wherever on this earth it may be, I want to create, as an extension of engineering, an architecture that the people of that place can feel proud about. And that relates to the note that I mentioned from Alex Tsonis and Liane Lefebvre about the potential of material transformations to create an identity of a specific place. In another town in Japan, where there's no maritime tradition, this probably would not have meant the same thing, or maybe nothing. Here, this means something to the people who visit the museum. And now, kind of as a closing parenthesis, this is a topic, the use of artificial intelligence software that is available to all of our students and to all of our faculty as well, is raising a lot of questions. It seems like we can actually feed the software all these properties that were on the chart that Bernard Cache was drawing. We can feed the procedures and we can feed the materials with their properties into the software and tell it to produce all these combinations. This is really how the software works. It takes also precedence. So it takes all the properties, everything you can feed to the software that is quantifiable or that has a precedent. So that becomes something that worries a lot of people. The question that I get almost every semester at the end of the semester in the last 3 semesters is, will artificial intelligence replace architects? All of these images, by the way, were produced by a software, Midjourney. So you can go online, it's like ChatGPT, and you can play with it. You can actually produce these. This is one of the things that comes out. The question, I would open it up, but maybe we can open it to discussion after that. I think, and this is another example of it. It looks like, so far, it can produce, well, already, it can produce quite convincing images of things that are possible. If we think of all of these, now that we have the justification to actually take procedures from processes from one material and apply them to another material, we know that there is probably a justification to do so. So that part of the software is probably okay in a way. So where do we come in at the end? I think this is where what's left to do if the software really wants to dominate the market, which I don't think is going to happen. So far, think about how architects have been working basically since the beginning of the industrial age. Since the beginning of the industrial age, we have been gradually relegated to selecting existing products from the market and organizing them. We select a door, we select a window, we select the type of concrete, and we organize them in space, and that becomes the building. Most of what's being built around the world is actually done like that. When you want a special case, then you need to be creative and inventive, etc. But that selection is precisely the work of the architect. And that organizing has been our work for the last 100 years at least, since the industrial products are on the market. And therefore, so far, the AI doesn't actually provide anything new. It just provides more options. But the selection is a question of what is good for a specific place and specific people. Now, we probably, I don't know if I convince you, that we are no longer in the age of truth. There's a lot of, in other disciplines, also a talk about the post-truth age. And beauty that used to be objective is probably no longer a criteria in architecture simply because we accept diversity. We accept that it's a question of culture and a certain disposition of certain people. So beauty is accepted in a much wider definition than it used to be, even in the 19th century. And therefore, maybe we are left with the good. And that is the question of choice. So as long as we can not program, or as long as we don't want to give the software this capability to choose and to select, we're good. I think we still have work. Thank you very much. I am happy to take any questions in any language. I mean, almost. Don't be shy. En français, ça marche aussi. It can also be about words, you know, things you didn't understand or you want me to repeat. Yeah. En français? Comme vous voulez.
Thanks for this presentation. I will try it in English. For the see bricks as bricks or wood as wood, we have to. I don't remember the word in English, but the Russian word was
Defamiliarization?
Yes, this word. Thanks. For after see all the details of this material, and after reinformation this material with all the detail we see, whether they
I'm trying to understand.
Yeah. Bon, en français, c'est plus pour voir le matériau tel qu'il est réellement, donc la brique en brique ou le bois en bois.
Oui.
Faut voir tous les petits détails en justement switchant de matériaux, comme avec la tasse de thé. En fait, c'est là où on voit tous les petits détails et on voit l'intention derrière pour pouvoir après réutiliser et pouvoir le sublimer, ce matériau. Après, c'est ça ou pas? Je n'avais pas trop compris.
Donc la question c'est à quoi sert la défamiliarisation des matériaux?
Yes.
En gros.
Oui.
C'est ça? Ok. Non, pas de problème. La première idée par rapport à la poétique, c'est la poétique, je pense que vient du grec ancien. C'est dans l'acte de création, on essaye de révéler ce qui est dans le monde. La poésie, ça sert à ça. Mais cette révélation n'est pas en vous montrant la chose telle qu'elle, mais en vous faisant découvrir quelque chose. Donc il faut travailler. Enfin, en tant qu'observateur, ce n'est pas donné, et donc ça ne va pas directement dans votre côté rationnel, dans votre compréhension, mais dans un autre côté qui n'est pas du tout logique, en fait. Donc ça suscite une réaction qui n'est pas rationnelle. Parce que quand vous montrez une brique telle qu'elle est, donc vous faites une arche, par exemple, ou le bois en tant que... enfin, une construction normale en bois, vous la comprenez tout de suite. Et donc, vous ne passez pas plus de temps à essayer de comprendre, est-ce qu'il y a une idée, est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose derrière, est-ce que ça révèle quelque chose que je ne connaissais pas. Et c'est pour ça que la défamiliarisation est importante dans un monde où ces techniques sont universelles. Parce que la brique, le bois, surtout le bois engineered wood, est le même partout où vous allez dans le monde. Donc si tout le monde emploie exactement le même matériau de la même façon, la planète va être complètement uniforme. Et donc, nous perdrons en fait toutes les particularités culturelles de chaque endroit où nous sommes. Donc c'est un peu à ça que ça sert aussi. J'ai répondu plus. Ok. Soyez pas si timide.
Bon, comme vous êtes bien parti en français, je continue en français.
Pas de problème.
Non, merci beaucoup pour cette conférence à la fois passionnante et très troublante. Je pense que ça nous prend un peu à rebrousse-poil par rapport à beaucoup de valeurs, voilà, ce qu'on apprend à l'école d'architecture, ce que nous on a appris, ce qu'on apprend à nos étudiants, ça prend le problème un peu à l'envers. Une chose que je trouvais très intéressante, c'est l'idée, alors voilà, on comprend bien cette idée de ne pas faire coïncider le matériau et sa procédure de mise en œuvre. Et quand vous le reliez reliez à un lieu et à une culture, et donc c'est bien par rapport... En fait, c'est un peu comme l'histoire de l'horizon d'attente en littérature. On a un horizon d'attente et en fait, la chose ne correspond pas à notre horizon d'attente. On s'attend à ce que le bois soit mis en œuvre de telle manière, il n'est pas mis en œuvre, etc. Et tout ça est très intéressant. Et alors, ce que je me disais, par contre, c'est que ça suppose, par exemple, qu'il y ait vraiment des procédures qui soient connues dans un lieu donné, culturellement. Mais est-ce que c'est toujours le cas ? C'est-à-dire que, est-ce que par exemple en Normandie, aujourd'hui, au XXIe siècle, finalement la procédure du colombage est-elle quelque chose qui fait partie de la culture des gens qui habitent en Normandie ? Et on peut se poser la question, parce qu'en fait, la plupart des bâtiments qui sont construits en Normandie depuis 100 ans ne sont pas produits par une procédure normande, en fait. Ils sont produits par une procédure globale, mondiale, universaliste, etc. Et donc, ça, alors, je pensais à ça donc il y a ça déjà qui pose question. Et puis, je me disais, par analogie, l'autre question, c'est les matériaux, eux. C'est-à-dire que, est-ce que ça marche assez bien avec les matériaux vraiment naturels ? C'est-à-dire que on comprend bien, je sais pas, en Normandie, il y a des hêtres. Donc, à la rigueur, on pourrait dire quelqu'un de Normandie, il sait ce que c'est qu'un hêtre, le bois de hêtre, etc. Mais alors, il y a tous les matériaux artificiels qui ne sont pas liés à un lieu, en fait. Et le béton, quand même, c'est le premier de cela. Alors, donc, entre ce truc de, y a-t-il encore des procédures identifiables à des lieux et à des cultures particulières, et y a-t-il des matériaux liés à des géographies, en fait ? Voilà, donc, tout ça pose plein de questions.
Merci. Bonne question. Pour faire court, deux références auxquelles je pense. La première par rapport au béton, justement. Il y a un livre magnifique de Adrian Forty qui s'appelle Concrete and Culture, où il vous fait un topo, justement, de la nationalité du béton. C'est-à-dire que le béton japonais, brésilien, suisse, etc., n'est pas le même. Même si c'est à la base la même mixture, il y a un caractère, si on peut dire, du matériau qui est ici issu d'une part de la mixture n'est pas exactement la même, et aussi la mise en œuvre n'est pas la même. Et donc, les gens qui sont, enfin, en tout cas de la génération du XXe siècle, qui ont vu ce type de procédure, ils sont habitués à un certain... Donc quand ils vont dans un autre état, ils voient un autre type de béton, c'est pas le même matériau. Donc il y a même dans des matériaux qui soi-disant sont universels, il peut y avoir des différences. Et ensuite, il parle aussi, par exemple, il y a différentes façons de mettre le béton en valeur par rapport à d'autres matériaux, comme la juxtaposition de béton et bois, que Louis Kahn fait par exemple, et d'autre part avec le travertin, avec la pierre. Et donc, il y a une sorte de... Cette juxtaposition donne un caractère local aussi à un matériau qui pourrait être universel. La première question que vous avez posée est difficile à répondre. C'est-à-dire, si j'étais aux États-Unis, j'aurais plus de mal à répondre parce qu'il faut être politiquement correct. Mais il est vrai que dans certains lieux dans le monde, notamment où la population n'a pas migré énormément, des cultures de construction ont évolué différemment que dans des endroits où la population vient de partout dans le monde, comme aux États-Unis, comme en Israël, d'où je viens, où il y a moins de... On ne peut pas vraiment parler de culture de construction. Alors aux États-Unis, ça s'est développé, bon, il y a 300 ans, mais on peut dire que certainement au Japon, il y a une culture de construction parce que les choses ont été fermées, clôturées pendant 250 ans, personne ne rentrait. Même si certaines technologies ont été importées, mais font partie du patrimoine culturel de l'endroit. Il y a d'autres pays où c'est vrai que ce n'est pas le cas. Et donc, la question aussi, c'est jusqu'où dans l'histoire d'un lieu ou du peuple ou dans la mémoire collective, si ça existe, on essaye de chercher. Donc, il y a des peuples qui doivent aller 2000 ans en arrière. C'est notamment ce qui se passe en Israël. C'est-à-dire qu'on cherche quelle est la culture de construction. Ah ben, il y a le temps biblique, évidemment. Donc, on peut construire avec des pierres massives, des choses... mais on aurait pu pourtant se référer à des structures nomades dans le désert. Parce que c'est aussi un choix par rapport au moment de l'histoire d'un peuple. Qu'est-ce qu'on choisit de mettre Et d'ailleurs, on le voit aussi. Récemment, j'ai enseigné un cours sur le climat et l'architecture, notamment en Afrique, qu'il y a une migration, en fait, quand certaines sociétés sont passées d'un matériau à un autre, c'est une question de sédentarité, parce qu'il y a eu des moments où les populations bougeaient à l'intérieur du pays, et il y a eu des moments où ils voulaient créer des monuments, c'est-à-dire rester à un endroit, construire une mosquée, par exemple, etc. Et donc, les techniques ont changé. Et c'est là qu'une culture de construction est devenue partie du patrimoine culturel local. Donc, je dirais que c'est un peu... c'est difficile de souligner exactement où. Et puis, il y a des moyens de contourner le problème, c'est-à-dire d'aller plus loin dans l'histoire. Après, je disais ça par rapport... C'est politiquement correct ou pas, parce que c'est parfois une volonté d'un gouvernement de créer une tradition. Il y a plusieurs livres qui parlent de la création d'une tradition. Que la tradition n'est pas forcément quelque chose dont on hérite, mais quelque chose qui est créé à un moment de manière volontaire. Et notamment au Japon, au XIXe siècle, on prend le Shinto comme la religion de l'État, et tous les monuments Shinto deviennent architecture impériale. Ce qui c'est pas forcément l'histoire c'est pas forcément le choix du peuple, c'est le choix d'un gouvernement. Donc, et par exemple, tout ce qui est bouddhiste n'est pas considéré comme architecture nationale pour la raison que ça a été importé de Chine. Donc, entre autres, voilà. Donc, il y a des... Je sais pas, ça répond un petit peu, oui, ça va.
J'ai une question. En fait, vous avez construit dans les 4 coins du monde, et je demande si... là, on a vu quelque chose vraiment bien posé, réflexion très scientifique, avec des exemples, avec les textes et tout ça, mais j'ai la suspicion que derrière, il y avait une expérience de terrain dans le monde où vous arrivez quelque part avec un point de vue, une idée de projet en tête, mais vous êtes... aller à la rencontre des architectes locaux, des travailleurs de bâtiments artisans locaux. Et peut-être là, vous avez subi des changements, des idées de mise en forme, de mise en réalité, des idées. C'est juste pour voir si ces expériences-là ont peut-être aidé à arriver sur cette réflexion qu'on voit aujourd'hui.
Enfin, je dirais que là où mon expérience... peut-être pas de chantier, mais en tout cas de conception de projets dans différents endroits. Là où ça m'a incité à reprendre des études, c'est justement l'inverse, c'est-à-dire que j'allais dans des contextes extrêmement différents et je retrouvais les mêmes discours par rapport, une sorte d'anonymité de l'architecture contemporaine, mais des désirs des clients qui sont complètement anonymes, c'est-à-dire c'est pour plutôt l'image. Il n'y a pas de volonté de créer quelque chose qui soit pertinent de manière culturelle pour une communauté. Et c'est ce qui me dérangeait plutôt. Et je dis que quelque part, c'est un peu notre rôle en tant qu'architecte, c'est pas forcément de donner au client que ce que le client recherche, mais c'est aussi de faire comprendre au client qu'il y a d'autres choses auxquelles on pourrait répondre en même temps qu'on satisfait les désirs de l'individu et qui serait éventuellement bien pour la communauté en général. Et à ce moment-là, le bâtiment devient restreint dans l'histoire ou dans la mémoire d'un lieu et un impact beaucoup plus grand que juste... donc c'est plutôt ça, et notamment le travail en Chine, où il y a énormément de capital qui se promène, des nouveaux riches, jeunes nouveaux riches qui veulent construire des tours, et leur modèle, c'est les États-Unis, le Japon. Mais pourquoi ? Vous avez des artisans extraordinaires en Chine, vous pouvez faire des choses que vous ne pouvez pas faire dans tous ces pays qui sont déjà au-delà, qui sont post-industriels, où la main-d'œuvre coûte beaucoup trop cher. En Chine, vous pouvez faire des choses magnifiques, mais ils ne sont même pas au courant que c'est encore possible, ou que ça a une valeur. Mais c'est en train de changer en Chine, justement. Donc il y a de plus en plus d'architectes contemporains qui essayent justement de harness, de prendre ce savoir-faire local et le fait que la main-d'œuvre soit encore bon marché, et d'en faire quelque chose pour une nouvelle architecture.
Oui, c'est moins une question qu'une remarque ou qu'un échange, mais j'ai souri quand tu as commencé ta conférence parce que tu as parlé de ton doctorat sur cette question de la vérité et j'ai retrouvé beaucoup de réflexions, mais sur des exemples qui n'ont rien à voir et avec des références théoriques que je n'ai pas forcément citées dans mon doctorat, mais j'avais rencontré le bâtiment que j'ai étudié, qui est l'orphelinat d'Amsterdam d'Aldo van Eyck, où il y a effectivement une question qui se pose entre, disons, la vérité d'un bâtiment tel qu'il se présente quand on le visite et la vérité du bâtiment quand on commence à l'analyser. Et j'ai beaucoup apprécié dans la présentation un certain nombre de détails constructifs qui sont, ou alors je ne sais pas comment tu as chopé les photos de chantier, des choses comme ça, mais il y a souvent des documents qui sont très compliqués à chercher. Par exemple, moi, j'ai pas encore trouvé de document de la maison Farnsworth de Mies van der Rohe qui m'explique comment les poutres et les poteaux sont soudés entre eux pour pas qu'il y ait de contreventement dans le bâtiment. J'ai beau acheter le détail qui est complet, 25 pages avec tous les dessins, mais il n'y a pas le détail de l'articulation entre les poteaux et les poutres. Et donc, il y a une incitation quand même très forte pour les étudiants en architecture et pour les architectes aussi à se renseigner derrière ce que l'architecture laisse apparaître. Dans le cas de l'orphelinat, il y a un système architectonique qui est très très lisible avec des poteaux, des poutres et un couronnement. Et quand on regarde les plans béton, les poutres, c'est de la décoration. Je ne sais pas si ce serait du textile ou quoi, mais en tout cas, il n'y a aucun rôle structurel. C'est juste là, alors que tout le discours de l'architecte est basé sur le principe de la restitution d'un cadre de cette nature-là. Et je ne sais pas dans quelle mesure les exemples que tu as montrés, il y avait plutôt une tentative de l'architecte de démontrer que la mise en œuvre, par exemple du bois dans la mairie, était bien quelque chose qui était agrafé à la façade et que ce n'était pas pour dire c'est faussement quelque chose de structurel, etc. Donc il y avait bien quand même une lisibilité dans les détails et je ne sais pas dans quelle mesure l'architecte, il y a une cohérence entre le discours que tient l'architecte et tel que le bâtiment est perçu, parce que dans mon cas, il y avait une dissociation entre le bâtiment tel qu'on le voit du point de vue de l'extérieur, le bâtiment tel qu'on peut le comprendre si on lit les plans béton et les plans de structure et qu'on regarde les photos de chantier pour voir comment ça s'est construit vraiment et qu'est-ce qui tient pas, qu'est-ce qui est structurel, qu'est-ce qui ne l'est pas. Et ensuite, le discours de l'architecte, parce que lui, en fait, il raconte aussi une autre histoire et tout ça fonde une compréhension assez... un territoire de compréhension du bâtiment qui est assez varié, sans parler du quatrième point qui sont ce que les gens vont raconter du bâtiment une fois qu'il est construit et qui va aussi donner ce qu'on appelle la réception d'un bâtiment et qui va laisser dans l'histoire une trace qui n'est peut-être pas celle que sa structure laisse à penser, quoi.
Tout à fait. Alors, j'ai plusieurs points. Premièrement, pour la Farnsworth House, je ne sais pas si tu connais le livre de Michael Cadwell qui s'appelle Strange Details, qui parle exactement de la défamiliarisation dans le Farnsworth House. Donc, il a fait des croquis des poutres et des soudures. Donc c'est un livre tout à fait sur le sujet, j'ai pas eu le temps de tout... là. La seconde chose, par rapport au discours des architectes vis-à-vis de certains bâtiments, je dis toujours à mes étudiants quand j'enseigne des cours de théorie que heureusement que les architectes parlent souvent très mal de leurs bâtiments parce que ça donne du travail à des gens comme toi et moi. Et c'est pour ça qu'il faut des historiens de l'architecture et des théoriciens qui font vraiment leur devoir et puis rendent quelque part l'architecture beaucoup plus accessible que ce que les architectes pourraient faire. Je dirais aussi, on n'apprend pas ça à l'école. C'est très rare que même les étudiants qui parlent vraiment bien de leur projet, de mon expérience, même après 5 ans d'études, il y en a beaucoup qui ne savent pas bien présenter le projet, et pourtant ça peut être un très beau projet. Mais tout ce qui est expression orale, la manière de présenter, c'est parfois... Donc sur ce point, voilà, donc je suis un peu ambigu par rapport à ça, et parlant d'ambiguïté, Kuma, entre autres, l'aspect d'ambiguïté est très important dans ce qu'il veut dire, quelque part. Ça fait partie du discours. C'est-à-dire que l'architecture doit être ambiguë parce que sinon, elle est trop forte. Elle est trop imposante. Et donc, dans son discours de weak architecture, c'est extrêmement important de ne pas être très clair par rapport à ça. Donc, il révèle certaines choses et d'autres choses, comme le béton dans cette mairie, est complètement caché. Mais je dirais que c'est dans l'esprit de Adolf Loos, sans la moralité, parce qu'il n'y a pas d'aspect moral chez Kuma du tout, mais sur le fait de... Et moi, j'avais fait une comparaison entre ça et le théâtre, certaines formes de théâtre japonais, parce qu'il y a une certaine forme de théâtralité. Il y a différentes approches de théâtre. Quand on va au théâtre, et d'ailleurs c'est un thème aussi que j'ai découvert par Gottfried Semper. Semper a tout un paragraphe, en fait, c'est une note de bas de page, qui est grande comme ça, et qui, si on ne la lit pas, on ne comprend pas tout son œuvre. Donc, mais il l'a mis en bas de page. Donc, où il parle du fait que c'est important, en fait, de cacher la nature des matériaux. Que les masques sont extrêmement importants pour l'expérience artistique. Et que dans l'architecture, il faut masquer certains matériaux. Parce que sinon, nous ne sommes pas pris dans l'effet, dans l'expérience esthétique. Et là où... Alors, Semper fait référence au théâtre tel qu'il le connaît à travers son ami Wagner, qui lui a demandé de construire un théâtre qui ne s'est pas fait à la fin, etc. Mais il a construit l'opéra de Dresde, etc. Donc il connaît le théâtre, un certain théâtre, le théâtre italien, enfin où le public est là et le spectacle se passe là. Et on est prêt, on accepte le fait que pendant les 2-3 heures du spectacle, nous sommes emportés dans un autre monde. C'est ce qui s'appelle suspending disbelief. Donc on laisse notre mécroyance à l'extérieur de la salle et on est prêt à prendre le show, l'illusion du spectacle. Et c'est ce qu'il pratique en architecture. Pour Kuma, parce qu'au Japon, il y a d'autres formes de théâtre, que par exemple, dans le kabuki, il y a des personnages habillés en noir qui se promènent sur la scène et qui bougent les pièces et les outils que les acteurs vont utiliser. Mais ils sont pourtant sur scène pendant que le spectacle a lieu, mais on les ignore. On sait bien qu'ils sont là, hein, mais comme ils sont habillés en noir, c'est une sorte de convention qu'ils ne font pas partie de l'action. Et donc, dans les bâtiments de Kuma, on a beaucoup de ça. C'est-à-dire, il y a des éléments qui sont mis en avance parce qu'ils sont rhétoriques. Et donc, c'est là que tout se focalise. Ils sont éclairés le soir. Et à côté, il y a un poteau noir en acier, en toute évidence, qui soutient la structure. Et pourtant, on est focalisé sur le bois. Comment ça marche? Ce beau pont, et là, il a 2 énormes poteaux en acier qui sont en toute évidence. Ils ne sont même pas cachés. Et on les emprunte en conversation. On sait bien que ce n'est pas vraiment un porte-à-faux, en fait. Et pourtant, on est pris dans le jeu. Donc, et ça, moi, je l'associe à c'est quelque part une approche culturelle spécifique à la théâtralité. Et si nous venons, et d'ailleurs, c'est pas du tout une question de Est et Ouest, parce que le théâtre japonais est beaucoup plus proche du théâtre grec ancien. C'est une question de tradition locale. Donc c'est pas, et le théâtre grec ancien est très différent de ce que nous connaissons aujourd'hui dans le théâtre européen, dans notre. Voilà. Donc il y a la question. Après, les masques c'est une autre conférence. D'ailleurs, et je dois dire que oui, là aussi, Slamper est essentiel et fondamental pour comprendre la valeur du masque en tant que métaphore entre les autres arts, en tout ce qui est art dramatique, mais tous les arts plastiques également. Et donc pour lui, l'architecture en fait partie. Et donc le masque est essentiel dans l'architecture. En tout cas, qu'on s'en serve d'une manière ou d'une autre, il faut être clair par rapport à son discours, par rapport au masque. Parce que si on le fait, il y a beaucoup d'architectes qui le font sans être au courant de ce qu'ils font. Et c'est là le problème, justement, c'est qu'il y a des incohérences. Et là, on trouve des détails qui ne font pas de sens. Et là, ce n'est pas dans une façon de défamiliariser, c'est juste un mauvais design.
So, going back into English, why not?
Je vais traduire.
I wonder, can we say there's a problem that could be called region washing? Like
region washing?
When you were talking about the different regional styles, it made me think of McDonald's and how you can go into McDonald's in different places and they sort of have. Maybe they have one sandwich with a French cheese in, or they have like the decor is related to the city where the McDonald's is. But everybody knows that McDonald's is McDonald's and it's not a regional business. And also, have you seen the Église Saint-Nicaise in Rouen?
Is that
It's the church which is covered with concrete.
I don't think so.
It's great. You should see it.
But I have seen the one called Jeanne d'Arc in the center that has an interesting wooden structure that I think is defamiliarized from the local boat building, which is actually relevant to this.
I think Saint-Nicaise, I'm not sure, but it's an old church that was covered in concrete to sort of save it in the 20s, I think. And so now it looks like a Gothic church, but concrete.
Sure.
And it's also falling apart.
Thank you.
D'autres questions, commentaires?
Juste poser une dernière question. À un moment, vous avez dit, ou tu as dit, quand finalement les matériaux sont assemblés de la manière qu'il faut. J'exagère, mais c'est presque. En fait, c'est plus de l'architecture, c'est une construction. Et du coup, je me demandais, c'est une sorte de mise à jour un peu du truc de Pevsner sur la cathédrale Lincoln, c'est de l'architecture, et le hangar à vélo, c'est une construction. Et donc, ça serait. Est-ce qu'on peut aller jusque-là, quoi ? C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, la bonne architecture, c'est toujours une architecture qui n'a pas l'air d'être ce qu'elle est, qui crée une décoïncidence, en fait, entre le matériau et la procédure. Et que quand, malheureusement, voilà. Alors finalement, l'architecture de Cannes serait je sais pas, il s'en sort pas très bien Cannes quand même de cette conférence, quoi. Et
mais d'ailleurs, enfin, je dois avouer que j'ai bizarrement un des bâtiments qui m'ont influencé en suscité une contre-réaction, c'est que j'ai grandi à Tel Aviv et il y a un bâtiment de Cannes qui est à 10 minutes de là où j'habitais. C'est un énorme bloc en béton que moi j'associais toujours à une sorte de forteresse impénétrable et que je trouvais un peu abject. Je ne voulais pas passer à côté. Et donc, dès que je pouvais, je me suis dirigé vers une architecture légère, Renzo Piano et Kuma, c'est juste tout l'inverse. Et il se trouve qu'à la fin, je me suis retrouvé à l'Université de Pennsylvanie où Kahn a enseigné et nous avons les archives de Louis Kahn. Voilà. Donc, donc, je me suis penché sur la question. Il y a des choses à apprécier, sauf qu'il faut aussi se souvenir que l'Université de Pennsylvanie est la première à prendre le système des beaux-arts et l'emmener aux États-Unis. C'est cette université qui a propagé le système des beaux-arts. Donc, on ne peut pas en vouloir trop à Viollet-le-Duc, mais enfin, j'adore sa contribution, il y a plein de bonnes choses. Mais il y a un moment, on connaît cette histoire, on sait que c'est une partie, et Louis Kahn était élevé dans cette tradition. Donc on ne peut pas lui en vouloir, il y a beaucoup de choses. Et d'ailleurs, il y a un moment, on prend Louis Kahn, on peut prendre Tadawando également au Japon. C'est d'autres traditions qui peuvent être tout à fait appréciables pour certaines fonctions, et tout à fait... et culturellement, je dirais même Kenzo Tange, alors Kenzo Tange c'est différent parce qu'il a différents moments de sa carrière, des moments où il va vers une chaîne beaucoup plus légère, beaucoup plus de structure tendue, etc., et des moments où c'est très lourd, etc. Et ça correspond à d'autres moments de la vie de la nation et de ce que le peuple veut. C'est ce qu'il dit lui. Hein. Il dit, le peuple veut des châteaux forts. Et donc, je leur donne des châteaux forts. Et après, il dit, maintenant, c'est plus la même chose, maintenant, c'est dématérialisé, donc... Et c'est au moment où il reçoit le Pritzker, il dit les jours ont changé, il n'a plus de travail au Japon du tout. Après les années 70, il doit aller travailler en Arabie Saoudite, au Koweït, etc. Donc ça c'est... Mais rappelle-moi l'autre partie de la question, parce que... C'était sur...
Non, mais il dit, est-ce que ce qui fait
oui,
l'architecture et sa signification, c'est forcément la non-coïncidence, ou est-ce que...
Tout à fait. Deux textes. Le premier de Vittorio Gregotti, dentro de l'architecture, je ne sais pas comment c'est en français d'ailleurs, Inside Architecture, où il parle justement de notre rôle en tant que vis-à-vis des produits industriels. Et dont, plus ou moins en même temps, il y a Kunio Maekawa au Japon qui écrit un texte qui ressemble aussi, qui parle aussi du fait que nous sommes devenus des gens qui assemblent des produits industriels et qu'on ne peut pas y échapper. Et la question, c'est comment contourner le fait qu'on est obligé d'utiliser des produits qu'on récupère off the shelf. Donc, il propose différentes façons, Gregotti, comment l'architecte peut, malgré cette situation dans laquelle on se retrouve, qui n'a pas changé, est devenu même pire, hein. Et maintenant avec le AI, c'est encore pire, parce que toutes les options, on a un catalogue d'options, même comment les assembler. Avant, on avait les produits, on pouvait prendre d'ici et là. Maintenant, le AI fait tout. Donc, le texte de Gregotti devient encore plus important, et là, il te parle, par exemple, des détails de la relation, de créer des relations entre différents éléments, tout ce que l'industrie ne sait pas faire. L'autre personne qui est extrêmement importante, c'est un texte qui s'appelle An Engineer Imagines, c'est de Peter Rice, où il dit l'ingénieur doit combattre l'hégémonie de l'industrie envers le secteur de l'architecture. Parce que si on les laisse faire, ils vont, à la fin, ils vont s'accaparer de l'intégralité du marché. Parce qu'ils produisent les produits, ils peuvent les proposer à des prix intéressants pour le client. Alors, ils vont s'en passer de nous. Mais on peut proposer quelque chose que l'industrie ne propose pas, c'est l'imagination. Parce que l'ingénieur, il a l'inventivité, et l'architecte propose la créativité. Et c'est l'inventivité et la créativité que l'industrie, c'est pas ni dans leur intérêt, ni dans leur façon de faire. Et c'est là que je dis, il faut toujours se poser la question, nous ne sommes pas les premiers à être un peu inquiets par rapport à ça. Le Corbusier avait peur de perdre le marché contre les ingénieurs. Il disait les ingénieurs font tout mieux que nous. Regardez la voiture, le Ford Model T, c'est beaucoup mieux que l'architecture. C'est aussi bien que le Parthénon, mais depuis le Parthénon, on a perdu le marché. Donc, mais finalement, je comprends son inquiétude, mais on n'a pas vraiment perdu. L'architecture est toujours là. Justement, il faut juste dire qu'est-ce que nous apportons à la table de négociation. Et c'est un peu pour cette raison aussi qu'en travaillant justement sur des projets commerciaux aussi, je me posais la question, qu'est-ce que j'amène à la table de négociation? Est-ce qu'on répète des formes locales? J'ai travaillé au Maroc par exemple. Le client voulait justement, c'était un Four Seasons Hotel, et le Four Seasons Hotel, contrairement au McDo, c'est une chaîne internationale, américaine, Le public qui est reçu est toujours le même, mais il se spécialise dans une architecture locale, régionaliste, dans chaque endroit. C'est pour ça qu'à Paris, ils ont un bâtiment haussmannien, et c'est pour ça que dans d'autres villes, ils ont des bâtiments typiquement locaux, mais régionalistes, et non pas quelque chose de... Donc là, je me suis posé la question, qu'est-ce qu'on amène? Quelle marge avons-nous? Et avec quel client? Il ne faut pas travailler non plus, ça c'est autre... Voilà.
D'autres choses? Sinon, je ferais remercier Ariel pour cette
Merci de
conférence
votre écoute.
masterclass super intéressant. Et bienvenue à l'école.
Merci beaucoup.
Et je ferai que tout le monde me joint en disant merci.